IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we share the journey of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners.
Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. Hope you're all well and keeping safe. On the podcast today, we have a very special guest, Vishnu Menon, a traveler and a student of history, who will help us travel back in time to the city of jinns. Let's hop onto the episode and find out more. So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Vishnu Menon, a student of history and a traveler to the Musafir Stories. Vishnu, thank you so much for being on the podcast and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Seth. This is the first episode about Delhi in this podcast, as I understand, so I'm sort of honored that I'm the guest here.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the first episodes, and also Vishnu has a little bit of a connection to the podcast in another way as well. Vishnu's dad, Sampath Menon, had done a wonderful episode on Mangalore. It's been a few years now. We'll definitely link it in the show notes too. But yeah, we do have a connection there, and maybe this is the first time as well where we do have father-son duo who have actually been on the podcast. So thank you, Vishnu. It's really our pleasure to have you on the podcast. And like you mentioned, it is going to be a very special podcast, I have a feeling. But before we get into the specifics, the intro I gave about you was very brief and concise. So why don't you speak a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Thank you. So I really don't have much more to add because I'm a student currently at Ashoka University, which is in Sonipat, Haryana, close to Delhi. Mm-hmm. I go to Delhi really often because I'm a student of history, and of course Delhi has so many things for a history student to see, and it also has lots of food at a cheap price, which is again the student part of history student. Since last year I've been running a page on Instagram called Charitra Sanchari, where I travel to monuments or historical sites wherever I happen to be, and I sort of take photos about them and write about them in English and Malayalam. So I've roamed around in Delhi a lot to, sort of find content for my page.
Wonderful. And we've been a follower of Vishnu's Instagram handle as well. And all of the wonderful things he's been posting, it got us really intrigued. And that's how this episode came into being. So before I kind of give away too many details, why don't you tell us where you're taking us and the listeners to today on the podcast?
Of course. So I'll be taking you guys to a large city, which used to be as famous for its multitudes of Jain temples and Sufi saints as it was for the gross displays of wealth and the decadent food which was enjoyed by the ruling class over there. It's a place where the king would give out elephants as gifts. It's a place where hundreds used to flock to a footprint of the Prophet Muhammad. So which city do you think I'm talking about? It's actually Delhi.
Yeah. I think it's definitely one of a kind, and it's been that way also, right? So many layers and layers and layers within, and if anybody's wondering why being a travel podcast based on India, we haven't covered Delhi this far, it's because of this very reason that that's so many layers that we just couldn't narrow down on a person who could cover and do justice. And again, a big disclaimer right at the beginning, this is not, we're not saying this is an exhaustive coverage of Delhi or part of Delhi or anything. This is a view of Delhi from Vishnu's perspective. That's what it is. And Vishnu, you tell us what way you're taking us to, and give us a little bit more background. I might have cut into your introduction of Delhi too.
As I've said, again, I'm an outsider. I was born and raised outside Delhi. I've only been here for the past 2 years for my college, and I don't speak Hindi like a native also. So I have roamed around a lot, and with what Hindi I know, which I like to think is decent, I have talked to a lot of people also. But the best thing about Delhi is that every person will have a different experience. You can roam around there for days and never get bored. When I'm talking about Delhi, we're specifically talking about Shahjahanabad, which is known as Old Delhi, even though there are older Delhis, which we will get to in a bit, but which is called Old Delhi, and it's a place which contained the best of Mughal architecture. I'm saying contained because a lot of it was destroyed both during the invasions by Nadir Shah, the Afghans and the Marathas in the 18th century, and then later, finally, during the British fighting in the 1857 revolt. But what remains is still magnificent. There's a lot of cultural, there's a lot of architecture. There's also a lot of cultural heritage which has stayed back. And of course, there's delicious food and a lot of shopping over there.
Yeah, wonderful. And Vishnu, when we're talking about Delhi again, it tends to have extreme of both temperatures, like winters can be brutal as well as summers, we all know about. When do you suggest is a good time to go and explore Old Delhi?
So I'd say that October and February, March are the best months because it's a time when it's transitioning from the heat to cold. So it's a sort of like Bangalore weather during those times. You won't sweat. It's pleasant. If you don't mind the cold, of course, November, December, Jan, you can go. Since I was born and raised on the coast, I'm used to heat and humidity. But as I've said, the temperatures are really extreme. They go up to more than 40 degrees in the summer, and they drop to around 2 degrees at nights in winter. So it's best to go during October, February, March.
Okay, wonderful. And also, you briefly mentioned about how historically also how significant this place has been. One of the things I latched onto was this is Old Delhi of the older Delhis also that have been around, right? So do you want to give some historical context about the place as well, about Shahjahanabad as well as the region in general?
Yeah, of course. So I'll just give a brief overview of the cities of Delhi. So Delhi is actually much older than people think it is. Everyone sees it as a Mughal capital, but even archaeological excavations go back to the Stone Age and really proto-historic periods like the Harappan Age. It's even mentioned in mythology that you might know the incident from Mahabharata where Krishna tells Duryodhana to give the Pandavas 5 villages to rule. And one of them is Indraprastha, which is considered to be modern-day Delhi. The oldest historical city of Delhi is called Lal Kot, which means Red Fort, but this is much older. It was established by Tomar Rajputs. The second one is Qila Rai Pithora, which is also Tomar Rajput place. Next one is Siri, which was established by the first Muslim rulers of Delhi. After that was Tughlaqabad, Jahanpana. There was Firozabad, which, as you may know, Firoz Shah Tughlaq moved his capital south to Daulatabad or Devgiri, and then moved back to Delhi, where he established Firozabad. Then there's Deenpana, which was Humayun's city. There was Shergah. Shah Suri drove Humayun out, demolished his entire city and built Shergah on top of that. And then comes Shahjahanabad, which is our topic of interest today. As the name suggests, it was founded by Shah Jahan. So the Mughal rulers had interests in the fine arts, for example. Jahangir was an appreciator of painting. Akbar, as he is famous for, was an appreciator of religious debates and literature, even though he was illiterate. Similarly, Shah Jahan was a great fan of architecture. It was said that he used to enjoy having his nobles bring him blueprints and plans of buildings in their provinces or buildings they were planning to build. When Dara Shikoh and Afzal Khan, who was an important officer at those times, built new buildings like Dara Shikoh's palace and such, they took him there to view it because they knew he loved it. Also at the time, which the time we're talking about is 1630s, at that time Agra was the imperial capital.
Right.
But the thing is, Agra was established on a strip of land around the river, and there were lots of problems with erosion, which were causing a lot of structures to crumble. So a mix of this and a mix of Shah Jahan's appreciation for architecture and a mix of every ruler's wish to have their name immortalized, Shah Jahan decided this was a great time to build a new city, and he went to Delhi. So Delhi hadn't been a capital city of anywhere for 100 years at this point, which is around 1639. Since Ibrahim Lodi was defeated by Babur. It wasn't the capital, but it already had lots of reverence by people as the historical capital of so many great kings and the center of pilgrimage because there's a lot of famous dargahs over there, the most famous being, of course, Nizamuddin's. Besides this, it also occupies a strategic position. It's both in the Indus and the Yamuna's watersheds. It's on the bank of the Yamuna itself. So Shah Jahan in 1639 started construction over there on the banks of Yamuna in Delhi. And then by 1648, that's when the inauguration, so to speak, of Shahjahanabad happened, the inauguration of the Red Fort. It was a grand affair. There were singers and performers from all over South Asia and Iran. the things that decorated all the buildings in the Red Fort, like there were silks from China, ornaments from Turkey, and of course singers from performers from all over the world. And of course, there were so many guests. And Shah Jahan freely distributed gifts. For example, he gave Darishko an elephant on this occasion. This isn't a history podcast. I've been digressing a lot. So, suffice it to say, Shah Jahan established one of the grandest cities in the Indian subcontinent at the time. He also gave a lot of plots of land to subordinate princes and amirs to build their own mansions. And each mansion itself was a massive affair. There was the person's house, there would be a temple or a mosque depending on their religious leanings, and there would be a whole sort of village and even bazaars around it, which were dedicated only to retainers of that mansion. So European travelers, you find writing about the wealth of it and saying that, each mansion is the size of a European township at that time.
Yeah, truly, it is one of a kind, right? And like you rightly pointed, it is such a unique confluence too, which has both sides of the spectrum, right from the materialistic to the capitalistic side to the spiritual side as well, in the form of Sufis and dargahs and the religious aspects of it as well. So really, really a unique combination. But we are going to add more things about the city itself and the outline of the city.
Sure. So the part that's Shahjahanabad is actually what was the old walled Mughal city. Like the fort, there were massive walls which stretch from the banks of the Yamuna all around the limits of where it is. And there were 7 main gates which were named after a place they opened to. There's Kashmiri Gate, which still stands today near the bus terminal, Mori Gate, Kabuli Gate, Ajmeri Gate, Turkoman Gate and Akbarabadi Gate. There are also 3 ghats because it faced the Yamuna on one side. There were 3 ghats for Hindus to cremate their dead, which are Nigambodh Ghat, Raj Ghat and Qila Ghat. So Nigambodh Ghat is still there today and still serves its original purpose. There's a temple there which they say was established by Yudhishthir. It's called Neela Chhatri Temple. Raj Ghat is famous today as the site where Mahatma Gandhi was cremated, and it has the samadhis or memorials for most of the great early Indian leaders. So Gandhi is there, Lal Bahadur Shastri is there, Nehru is there, Indira Gandhi is there. Qila Ghat, I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find out anything about its fate, but it's probably just renamed and it's further around the river.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of things have kind of changed. Now, in terms of how the city itself was built out, right? Like I said, for about 100 years before, it wasn't the capital as such until Shah Jahan decided to move here and build the city around this. Do you want to quickly give an overview of the prominent structures of the city as well? And I know we keep mentioning Old Delhi, but we're talking about things like the Red Fort, Jama Masjid, and these were the primary structures around which the city was built also, right? Do you want to give a quick overview of those places? Not a deep dive, but yeah, high level as well, just so for somebody who's visiting for the first time.
Sure. So city of Shahjahanabad is sort of centered around 2 structures mainly. One is the Red Fort and the other one is the Jama Masjid of Delhi. The Jama Masjid, the construction started in 1650 actually, which is almost more than a decade after Shahjahanabad was inaugurated, and completed in 1656. Also a quick note, Red Fort and Jama Masjid are just what they're called today. So actually Red Fort used to be called Qila Rai Mubarak, which means the fortunate fort, and Jama Masjid is called Masjid-e-Jahan Numa, which means the mosque that reflects the light of the world. A Jama Masjid is a type of mosque, so that's why it's called that today. The Red Fort and Jama Masjid face each other because the emperors, until Aurangzeb, the emperors would go and from the Red Fort up to Jama Masjid to pray. There used to be relics of the Prophet Muhammad which were brought from, I think, Kashmir or someplace, which were in the north gate of Jama Masjid. And it used to be much more richly decorated than you see it today. Same goes for Red Fort, of course. A lot of the palaces and such inside the fort were torn down and replaced by barracks after the 1857 revolt. After Jama Masjid, there were 9 major mosques which were established by amirs, noblemen, and begums, who are the wives of the emperors. Out of which Fatehpuri Masjid, which faces the Red Fort on the other side of Chandni Chowk, is the best known. And there were numerous other mosques, havelis, temples, which you'll find if you go roaming around these streets. There also used to be a canal down the center of Chandni Chowk, and lots of trees, which you can't imagine today if you go there. But it used to be a very cool, leafy place. But unfortunately, a canal, of course, it choked in the 18th century itself, and a lot of the trees were demolished as the city started to expand.
Yeah, I think I read a very interesting tidbit about Chandni Chowk, right? How it got its name as well, right? Like these canals, I think at some point they would form an, I wouldn't say a pond necessarily, but almost like a little fountain or a area like that, and you could see the reflection of the moon in that, and that's how like it got its name, is what I read. Any background to that,
Yeah.
Vishnu?
Yeah, what you said is exactly right. Actually, the entire road wasn't called Chandni Chowk. That's just what we call it now. So in the past, the road from the Red Fort until the center of the market used to be called Urdu Bazaar, where Urdu means military camp. At the center, as you mentioned, sir, was the fountain where the light of moon would be reflected, and that was called Chandni Chowk. And then when you go from the center up till the front of Fatehpuri Masjid was where it was called Jahanara Begum Chowk. So it actually has 2-3 names which are sort of pushed out or displaced by the name Chandni Chowk.
And I believe it was Jahanara Begum that undertook the construction. Like this area, Chandni Chowk, was built by her. I understand, right?
Yeah, it was developed by her as a market.
Yeah, yeah.
There's the Delhi town hall now, which used to be her sarai, caravan sarai for merchants who are visiting from afar. And it's apparently one of the grandest buildings to rival the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid, but that was pulled down and replaced with a town hall in the British times.
Yeah, a lot of different layers here, and I think if we get into this, we'll start sounding like a history podcast. So we'll make a quick diversion here and look at it more from a perspective of somebody who's visiting here, and what sort of experiences, what sort of places, etc. one might be able to see and feel. So from that perspective, I know you've done a great job in setting out the context and what to expect once somebody gets here. But what I was saying is, for somebody who's visiting here, maybe they're looking to explore the part of the city, they do have time to spend beyond the popular monuments in Delhi that usually first-time visitors go to, right? Some of them we already mentioned, like the Red Fort, like the Jama Masjid, and maybe Qutb Minar and places like that. But if somebody has more time to explore Old Delhi,
Yeah.
what would be the best way to get around here? Because this is also a very densely populated region of the country too, right?
Yeah. Well, the first question is, of course, how to get to there. I wouldn't really recommend staying in Old Delhi because most of the places to stay are like lodges and rooms, the sort. Except for one, there's a place called Haveli Dharampura, which is a restored 19th century Haveli. And it's now a very upscale hotel, so it's quite expensive, and they give you the full experience, like how you have those fort hotels in Rajasthan and such. But besides that, there aren't really good places to stay in Old Delhi, so it's better to stay nearby and take a metro to Old Delhi. There's several stations depending on where exactly you want to get off. Once you're there, the streets are so thin, the best thing to do is walk. And there's a lot to see when you're walking. There's a lot to see, there's a lot of food stalls, so there's a lot to eat also. You won't be bored at all. You can walk for hours within the gullies. Of course, you have to be careful, especially if you're a woman or if you don't know how to speak Hindi properly. You have to be careful at some places, but most of it is quite safe, and the people are very helpful as well.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, that was one thing I can definitely vouch for. In my time there too, we made sure we walked as much as possible. So that might be the best way. There's only caveats being, yeah, what time of the year you visit there, depending on that too. You may have to be appropriately dressed as well. When I say appropriately dressed, I mean to say more like warm clothes or good walking shoes and things like that, not necessarily being modestly dressed as such. But yeah, quickly going back, right? In terms of the types of things we see also, you've already set a great context that the history literally has been a confluence and a melting pot of people from different places, religion, just going back, right? There's so many versions of Delhi itself. So I'm sure there's remnants and places of significance, etc., that are there. And some of them might actually have kind of gotten blended into the existing structures and the existing establishments as well. So as you walk about, what are some of the things one can explore? Do you want to start off, I don't know if you have a preference by starting with places of, let's say, historical significance, or other places like places of religious significance, temples or mosques and stuff like that. Anything in particular you'd like to start off exploring with us, Vishnu?
Sure, if you want me to go in particulars, there's far too much, so I'll just give a sort of general overview.
Yeah, sure.
So a lot of structures, as I mentioned, were demolished during the 18th century raids in Delhi and also the 1857 revolt. But that still leaves a lot of material culture behind, even though a lot of it was rebuilt after a war. For example, of course, there's the giant Jama Masjid, there's also Fatehpuri Masjid, but there's so many smaller mosques all over the place which have interesting local anecdotes connected to them. For example, there is a place which is colloquially known as, if it's okay to use a bit of a coarse word in Hindi, it's Randi Ki Masjid, because it was established by it was established by a courtesan. It's now renamed to Mubarak Begum Masjid because that was presumably the name of the courtesan. It was derogatorily known as Randi Ki Masjid because perhaps of her detractors, or maybe because the courtesan took a lower position in the social hierarchy post the British conquest. But yeah, if you go around any corner, you'll be able to find all sorts of historical structures, and around them there'll be people who are very happy to explain the significance of this to you. They'll tell you long stories. It'll be more of a problem to get away from them, although it's a happy problem. There's also numerous temples. So when you're talking about Delhi, first of all, and when you're talking about Mughal Empire, secondly, temples are not something that come to mind at all, right? When they do come to mind, it's the whole thing about them pulling down temples and the Babri Masjid debates and such. I don't want to get political, sorry. But there are actually a lot of temples in Old Delhi. The reason for this, of course, is there were several Hindu courtiers. Khatri and castes of Hindus had a heavy role to play in the business in Shahjahanabad, and there were also Jains who controlled a large part of the market economy at that time. And they were extremely rich. When they gained all the money, of course, they decided to build religious places because that's good karma. And a lot of them survive today, but you won't see them on tour guides, for example, or you won't really see them as imposing from outside. If you know where to look, you'll find them, and they're beautiful. So let me tell you, for example, there is, I mentioned Haveli Dharampura earlier. It's in an area called Dharampura where Jain merchants used to live. So if you find a way to street where Haveli Dharampura is and walk up and down it, you'll find 4 or 5 old Jain temples, which all date from the 17th century onwards. And the insides are absolutely stunning. You'll have to sort of see it to believe it, but they're painted with gold. Like they've used gold paint. There's really good carvings. There's really good decorations. In one place where I went, they had Jain idols, small idols, which were carved out of precious stones, different precious stones. So like the Navaratnas, so like emeralds and sapphires and such, which they keep in a safe and just open for, to show people for darshan. Similarly, there's a lot of Hindu temples also, especially in this place called Esplanade Road. You find a lot of Hindu temples, but I found so far at least the Jain temples are generally kept better than the Hindu. They're preserved better than the Hindu temples. The owners sort of have restorationists come in and do a good job on the Jain temples.
One other interesting feature I saw there, and I don't know if this is across most temples or a handful of them that I came across too, was one, like you rightly said, very unassuming, right? If you don't know where to look, you may easily pass them. And the other thing also that I noticed was a lot of these temples, they also have, I won't say appropriated or co-opted, but you could easily see domes, right, which usually tied to Islamic architecture.
With,
exactly. So things like that as well. And then around them, I'm assuming at a later time, like the shikhars or the usual North Indian style temple, right, the Nagara type of architecture, that comes into the play. So that was also very interesting for me to see how it's not necessarily very rigid in terms of what temple architecture would have been from that period. It's very kind of fluid that way.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. For example, the kalasha, which was originally it's a Hindu ritual object, which is also quite commonly found in Indo-Islamic architecture.
Yeah, that's true. You'll find it, especially in a lot of these dargahs, right? And that, and even the concept of lighting diyas or the deepas that you would say, right? At least in South
Yeah,
India, I've seen a lot of that where dargahs have that concept of the diyas and deepas as well, and the kalash, like you mentioned. I think if we get into the traditions of that time too, it went both ways, like you mentioned. I think there's been a lot written about how Diwali, for example, was celebrated in Delhi, and also like broadly, won't say sponsored, but endorsed by the ruling Mughal kings also, right? While you would think
yeah.
that it might not be a natural thing, that to even Holi and stuff like that. There's a lot of things. Again, if we get into the specifics, we probably have to do an entire series just on Delhi and Delhi's intricacies. But yeah, getting back to the quick point, yeah, you're talking about some of the Jain temples and the religious structures, right, in the area as well. One can see any of the other types of structures, and maybe do you want to also give a quick shout out to some of the Sufi structures like the dargahs, maybe, and the Sufi connections also, right? Delhi has been very significant for Sufism too.
Of course. So, yeah, as I mentioned, when Delhi was not a capital after Ibrahim Lodi's defeat, it remained a pilgrimage center. And there's a lot of important dargahs. So, in the times when Shahjahanabad was established, they were sort of outside the city. They were in the countryside, in Mehrauli and Chirag, what is today Chirag, Delhi. And there were a few really important dargahs whose festivals used to be celebrated with great vigor. So obviously, most famous one is Nizamuddin Dargah, which featured the movie Rockstar, and the famous song Kun Faya Kun was shot all around it. But back in the day, the biggest festival, the biggest Urs festival, used to be at a dargah called Qadam Sharif. So Qadam Sharif is a tomb, but the interesting thing about this one is it's not the person in the tomb who's being venerated. Inside the tomb is supposed to be Firoz Shah Tughlaq's son. But that's not really important. People didn't even know who the person buried there was for the longest time. What's important was that Firoz Shah Tughlaq had sent a spiritual advisor of his to Mecca, who brought back what are said to be the footprints of Prophet Muhammad and installed them in this tomb of his sons. So that used to be a massive celebration because, of course, it's a relic of the most important person in Islam. So thousands of people, the noblemen and commoners alike from Delhi, would come to to Qadam Sharif to celebrate it. Besides this, in Basant Panchami, which is the spring festival according to the Hindu calendar, there used to be a whole round of these dargahs. So on day one, I forgot the exact order, but the dargahs involved were Nizamuddin, Qutbuddin Kaki, Qadam Sharif, Chirag Delhi, and a few of the others. So people would come there, they'd participate in celebrations, go back. Next day they'd go to the next one, go back. So that's also an interesting, facet of Indo-Islamic culture, which is the sort of celebration of Basant Panchami. Besides, the dargahs also attracted Hindu, Jain, Sikh visitors because they transgressed religious boundaries.
Truly some very interesting concepts, and a couple of other things also, like as you're walking around Delhi and old Delhi and experiencing all of those things, one thing that definitely has been even since those times, and probably even before old Delhi itself, has been the vibrant marketplaces of Delhi, right? And some of these are obviously still there, and you could say they've kind of transformed into the new age of the 21st century marketplaces. Do you want to touch upon those, like some of these that are still around, especially in the old Delhi area?
Of course. So Delhi, Shahjahanabad, when it was being planned out, was of course supposed to be a city of markets. And the basic planned unit was a mohalla. So there are two types of mohallas. The ones where there's a really rich person's mansion and it's all the settlements that spring up around it. And there's those which belong to a certain community or a certain caste or a certain profession. So, for example, the Kaists would have a mohalla, the Shiites of Iran would have a mohalla, such like that. So some of these mohallas sort of gain specialty for selling certain goods. And these specialty markets are a feature that is still around today. So, for example, if you go to Chowdi Bazaar, which is one part of Old Delhi behind Jama Masjid, you find a lot of sellers of brassware, copper, metalware basically, and also of paper. So, greeting cards and specialized sort of paper, you find a lot of that there. There is a region called Katra Neel, which used to be famous for indigo. Indigo was in great demand at that time, but it's now a wholesale cloth market, and also there's a lot of old temples there. But if you're going to talk about present day, of course, if you clothes are of course the main attraction for anyone coming to Delhi, because it's only in Delhi that you can get really good sort of lehengas for women, kurtas and sherwanis and such for men at a reasonably low price. So if you're walking down Chandni Chowk and you go into any of the gullies, you'll find dozens of vendors who are calling out to you, displaying their goods and such. It's better, I feel, to go into the gullies if you're shopping, because the ones on the main road are much more tourist price, from what I understand. So you get all sorts of clothing items there, ornaments there. There's also Lajpat Rai market, which is basically Delhi's Chor Bazaar. You get all sorts of rip-off goods there. I went with a friend a few months back, and he bought a Rolex watch from a guy who had a stall not even the size of a sink. So anything's possible once you get to that part. And of course, there's food, which will be covered coming up soon, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. We'll again, that's another world in itself, right? So we'll leave a little bit towards the end to cover the food. And can you also talk to us a little bit more about, let's say, for example, Khari Paudi, right? The spice market side of the things. Yeah, can you touch upon that too? It's supposed to be a very large spice market as well, I understand.
It's said to be Asia's largest spice market. So you get like wholesale and retail sellers of all sorts of spices, dates, raisins and such. When you go all the way to the end of Chandni Chowk, across a Red Fort, like where Fatehpur Masjid is, and take a left, you'll be in Khari Bauli. It's named after a stepwell, a Bauli that's somewhere in the area. You also get a lot of antiquities there, I've heard. You get like old coins and such by some street sellers. So it's interesting for those who want to, sort of try out Indian spices, which may be rare.
Yeah, very interesting. And what about the other part of the town? Like, for example, Meena Bazaar also has a bunch of markets and sellers and stuff like that, right? Any experience walking around there, Vishnu?
Yeah, Meena Market it's in front of the main gate of Jama Masjid. It's a massive sprawling bazaar that goes all the way to a main road, and it's extremely crowded. Compared to Chandni Chowk, it's a bit more difficult to walk there because of the crowd, and also it's not as covered as the sides of Chandni Chowk. So honestly, I'd recommend shopping in Chandni Chowk, but in Meena Bazaar you also get really good kebabs, so you can pick your priorities.
Yeah, or maybe do all the walking and shopping in Chandni Chowk, and then towards the end maybe come the side of the sound. So anyway, you have to have your fill also, right? You have to eat anyway.
Yeah,
maybe that might be a good part. And also I hear about the book markets as well that are pretty popular and pretty huge. You want to touch upon those too?
Sure. So the bookmark, there's one book market in a place called Nai Sadak, which connects Chandni Chowk with Jama Masjid. But what you get there is mostly textbooks and school books and other sort of stationery items, wholesale and retail. But if you go a couple of kilometers south of Jama Masjid, you're still in Shahjahanabad. It's a place called Daryaganj. And every Sunday, there's a field there called Mahila Haat. It's not a field, a large open ground called Mahila Haat, where every Sunday a huge amount of booksellers descend upon it, and they not exactly stalls, they set out a large variety of books, all sorts of random books in all sorts of languages. Like I found Soviet era textbooks written in Russian. There is even like antiquity sellers. So for example, there was a person who was selling postcards which were from like the British era, and they were written in like archaic scripts like Landa, which are not used today in North India. So you can spend hours there just looking at all the huge collections of books they have. You'll find books which probably were for older people, which were published which you might remember from your childhood, which were published really long ago and sort of perhaps decommissioned. Or maybe there's a book you read ages ago and you forgot all about, and then you see it there and all the memories come rushing back. So Daryaganj, if you're there on a Sunday, it's a must visit.
Yeah, probably can spend the whole Sunday or part of a Sunday just being lost in the sea of books. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
for
for
sure.
book lovers, it's definitely a must check out. But yeah, it just gives you a sense of the different types of markets also that have existed over the years, and the varieties, right? Like everything from spice to cloth to metalware to now books as well. We've covered off. There's just so much variety, and obviously you may want to sample some of these. And Chandni Chowk might be a good area, right, to kind of get a experience of a bunch of these markets without having to like really move from place to place.
Yeah.
And as we kind of were getting towards the conversation anyway, in the like a few minutes ago, as you're walking around, I'm sure you have to re-energize and refill, right, the tummy.
Yeah.
Food is it's never, or options of foods is never a question in Delhi, right? There's all types of foods available. What would you suggest? Like, what are some of the options one might have while walking around Old Delhi?
Yes, Delhi, of course, is a cosmopolitan place, but when you come to Old Delhi, you find foods which are more, let's say, traditional North Indian in the form of, let's say, Mughlai and chaats and such. What I've noticed is generally Chandni Chowk side eateries are vegetarian, and when you go more towards the Jama Masjid side, you find more non-vegetarian eateries. So, if you're starting from the Chandni Chowk side, there you get really good chaats. There's a shop called Nataraj where they serve dahi balla and aloo tikki, which are apparently the best in town. I haven't gone there as of yet. There are so many shops where they sell kachoris and other chaat items, and almost all of them you'll uniformly get really good food. Then, of course, there's sweets like lassi, there's rabdi, there's kulfi. All those are good. There's one specific place called Old Famous Jalebi Wala down Chandni Chowk, where they serve large jalebis with rabdi, and they're absolutely delicious. They're some of the best jalebis you'll have. When it becomes winter in the mornings, they have a special sort of food called Daulat ki chaat, which is made by whipping milk cream with some other ingredients for hours. And it's so soft that once you touch it to your mouth, it literally melts. So it's a winter specialty. You'll only find it when in the coldest months and only in the morning, because it sells out by afternoon. They say that they mix the dewdrops of the morning in that sweet. So that's a must try if you're in Delhi in winter. One more thing I find in Chandni Chowk, of course, is chole bhature and chole kulche, without which discussion of Delhi food would be incomplete.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, so when you move towards the Jama Masjid side, you find a lot of kebab shops where they're grilling kebabs in the front, like facing the road, and all the smells come towards you. And you know how in old cartoons, like for example, Tom and Jerry, Tom smells a pie and goes floating through the air.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, it sort of feels like that whenever I walk by there. And they're also like very reasonably priced. Like for 100 rupees, you can get a plate of kebabs with rumali roti. So over there, when you go, of course, Sikh kebabs are a must try. There is Qureshi kebab, where you get these sort of kebab dishes. There's Al Jawahar, Rahmatullah, which are also both famous hotels for these. One of the gates are Jama Masjid, the West Gate. In front of that, there's a road where all sorts of eateries are there. Like most of the eateries are down that road. So when you head down that, you meet with a lot of famous restaurants. The most famous one being Kareem's. You must have heard of it, right? Yeah, it's the people who run it. They are supposed to be descendants of the royal Mughal cooks in the 19th century, and they wanted to bring the same flavors to a common person after Mughals got deposed. So it was founded more than 100 years ago, and it's been consistent since then. Although it's more pricey compared to other places. Then when you go down, there's Aslam's where they serve butter chicken. But butter chicken's not the sort of Punjabi creamy curry. It's literally chicken slathered in butter. They put like half a slab of butter to submerge the grilled chicken. It's so soft that it sort of falls apart on your touch. Like you can demolish a plate within 5 minutes.
Interesting. Yeah. Also, like you said, sounds like it's very different to the usual Punjabi style butter chicken that we tend to associate with Delhi.
Yeah. Butter chicken, that's why butter chicken also is invented in Delhi in a restaurant called Moti Mahal, which is now a global chain. There's also Nihari. Nihari is a really thick, fatty curry, and that which is served with tandoori roti, and you get really good ones in a place called Hilal, which is down a side street again. Um, and then, of course, all around the road there are people who sell Sharbate Mohabbat, which is a mix of Rooh Afza, milk, and watermelon, which is an amazing cooler. You'll feel rejuvenated once you have a glass of it. So once you're done with a busy time of eating kebabs, you can wash it down with Sharbate Mohabbat and maybe go to a place called Cool Point and have Shahi Tukda, which is again heavenly.
That is, if you have enough room in your stomach. But yeah, I do completely agree on the need for washing down after you've had fatty and rich non-vegetarian dishes that you just mentioned, right? And very interesting
Yeah.
name too, right? Sharbate Mohabbat.
Yeah. There's a lot of shops which say Sharbate Mohabbat, Sharbate Nafrat, which I feel is unnecessarily dramatic for a cool drink.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, it does definitely sound something you need after all of the binging you do in these side streets of Jama Masjid, right? This is the Meena Bazaar area around that you're saying.
No, it's the other side. It's the other gate from Meena Bazaar. So
Oh,
Meena
okay.
Bazaar is at the north gate. This is at the
Okay.
west gate. Of course, one disclaimer when we're talking about food is that not all the places have the most hygienic conditions where they're preparing it. So if you're coming from abroad where you're used to hygienic food or you have stomach problems, it's better to either have pills handle the stomach problems, or nowadays a lot of them have opened sort of more hygienic restaurants. Near the front of this road there are like covered AC restaurants for Al Jawahar and Aslam's, and Kareem's of course is also quite hygienic, so you could restrict yourselves to those places which also have delicious food.
Yeah, I mean, we had a movie called Delhi Belly, so we don't have to talk too much about it, but definitely do use some caution, especially if you're not used to eating a lot of street side food and stuff like that. It might not be something that will go down very easily, right? So make sure you do take some caution. But yeah, all of this, like Vishnu mentioned, once you start to get the I don't know what words to use to describe the smells emanating out of these different eateries and them doing the grills outside. I'm sure on purpose, right? So people can get attracted to them. You literally start floating in
Yeah.
the air, and I don't know if there's any holding back after that. Now, having kind of touched upon like most of the aspects, right? As you're walking around, you see a lot of these different things, right? From the markets to the food places to historical structures, religious structures, places of the Sufis and stuff like that. Any other types of places or places of interest that you may want to call out that we may not have touched upon or sampled?
Sure. There's I forgot to mention when it comes to eateries. There's also a new cafe I've heard about, which is called the Gumbad Cafe, and it's located on a rooftop with views of the Jama Masjid. So those who want to save their stomachs again could pay a visit there. Other than that, I think the most fun about roaming around in Old Delhi is sort of going around the winding lanes and not knowing what you're seeing around the corner. You'll find any sort of historical thing. You might find a sadhu or a fakir walking around even sometimes. So sort of the fun is just walking around and seeing what comes up, and you can make your own plans from there.
Yeah, for sure. And one other thing that I also is an experience. I mean, not for the faint-hearted, but especially these really crowded streets, right? I think I tried this around the Chavdi Bazaar area. You can hail a rickshaw ride, right? And I'm not saying a tuk-tuk or a auto rickshaw. I'm saying these people who drive these rickshaws. I don't know if they're still a thing, Vishnu. They probably are, right? Where you can basically pay for somebody to drive you around or give you a ride around in a rickshaw where you just sit back. It's like maybe three people can sit at the back.
Yeah, there's motorcycle rickshaws, cycle and bicycle rickshaws both.
Yeah, these were bicycle rickshaw, and I should say this was a sort of adventure sport, really, right? I don't know how he managed at the speed he was riding, especially not to hit anybody, right? And they probably like put on a show as well if you're somebody from the outside, if you're a tourist. The only thing I regret is I didn't shoot the whole thing. But it was also because I was holding on to my life, right? I thought at any time he would hit somebody or we'd topple over. But he managed to literally take us around a few streets in the narrow lanes of Chavdi Bazaar without really even touching anybody. So if you want a little bit of a thrill added to a lot of this, maybe try that out. Perhaps don't try it out after you've had stomach full and after you've eaten a heavy meal. Try it out before that, but it's definitely something worth it. I call it an adventure sport of sorts. I think as we start to kind of close down on the episode too, any other places in the vicinity, again, not necessarily tied to Old Delhi, that you would also like to touch upon?
So one thing you can't say about the Delhi metro is that it isn't vast. Like, you can say it's dirty, you can say it's unprofessional, you can say you don't like the people, but you can't say it doesn't get you anywhere in Delhi.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's a great advantage because there's a bunch of stations in Old Delhi which you can just step into a metro and go anywhere else when you want a break. Historical significance, of course, I can never get tired of talking about, but of course there's a Qutub Minar which is at the end of the yellow line, which is one of the lines that go through Old Delhi, which is the other major cluster of monuments. It's also Purana Qila and a few others, but again, it depends on the type of traveler you are. Regarding things, other interesting things, a few stops south of Old Delhi is of Chandni Chowk station on the yellow line is Rajiv Chowk, which is Connaught Place. Which is again a very famous area. There's all sorts of, it's a very hip and modern area. So you find all sorts of bars, trendy restaurants and such. There's a very vibrant nightlife scene there. So you can go there after a day out in Old Delhi. There's also good hotels in the area, so it would be good to base yourself there if you're visiting Delhi. If you go north, for example, there is a place called Majnu Ka Tilla, which is MKT or MT, which is it's like a very prominent student hangout, especially for people from DU North Campus, because it's you get good food for really cheap. That's pretty much half of what students are after. It's a Tibetan colony, so after the 1959 invasion of Tibet, this was one of the plots of land they were given to settle. And they've opened a lot of restaurants and entertainment places. And so you get imported food like Korean and Japanese foods, Korean and Japanese restaurants where the chefs actually trained in these countries, karaoke bars and such. And it's becoming increasingly popular because of a wave of popularity of, Korean and Japanese pop culture in India. Then, of course, if you want a bit of relaxation, you can go to the ridges. So there's North Ridge, which is again near Majnu Ka Tilla, which is a hill, forested hill. It's a protected site. You see a lot of monkeys. If you go there in October, it'll be quite cool and it'll sort of remind you of trekking places else in more isolated areas of India. There's also there's also Rajgat and Shantivan, which are right behind the Red Fort, which are also well laid out gardens. But yeah, as you have mentioned several times, if we want to cover every aspect of Delhi, we'll be going on for days with a podcast dedicated to its own, so I'll stop here.
Yeah, Delhi needs its own podcast. I think that's what it is, right? I think
Yeah.
somebody should start a podcast just focused on Delhi, and I'm sure it'll be on top of all charts and it'll run for a long time too. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much for kind of touching upon those places in the vicinity too. Obviously, if you have more time beyond just Old Delhi, you could visit some of the other places as well. And as we start to wind down, we have kind of spoken about the setting up of Delhi, how it rose to prominence, how it's been the center of big empires and a confluence of not just people and activities, but even in terms of religions and historical events and stuff like that. Could you also shed some light towards this transformation and more of a decline of Old Delhi and Shahjahanabad, right? How did that play out, and what have been some of the important events that have kind of led slowly to the decline of the empire itself and Old Delhi in general?
Sure. So, Shahjahanabad was inaugurated in 1648, and for 100 years after that was its sort of heyday, which was when it was the wealthiest and greatest place. In 1739, Nadir Shah, who was the Shah of Iran, took advantage of like the weakness of India to, raid into the country and penetrated all the way to Delhi, where he massacred a lot of the people. He took away the Mughal throne and a lot of treasures from the Red Fort. And that sort of deflated the Mughal bubble in the eyes of lots of people on the subcontinent. So in 1754, Maratha mercenaries raided the city because they didn't receive sufficient payment for their services from Safdarjung, who was one of the Nawabs of Awadh and nominally a Mughal officer. 1757, Ahmed Shah Abdali also stormed Shahjahanabad and even drove out Shah Alam. Sadashiv Rao Bhau, another Maratha, conquered it in 1759. The Afghans took over again. In the 1780s, there was famine. 1787, the Rohilla Pakhtuns took it over again. Finally, in 1803, the British took control of it. And actually, contrary to what people think, there was a sort of efflorescence after the British took over it. Because for a long time, because of the weakness of Delhi, there was... people were afraid to venture outside the walls because there are lots of raiding parties of Marathas, Mewatis, Pashtuns, Sikhs and all they were afraid to attack them. So people rarely left the city except for pilgrimage purposes to visit the tombs we've talked about. When the British came, they sort of repaired the fort walls. They tried to restore the buildings, like a minar of the Jama Masjid, they crumbled and they restored it. And they established a cantonment near Kashmiri Gate in North Ridge. And people started settling outside the walls towards the side of their cantonment again. But in 1857, as we know, the revolt started. And, first of all, in the fighting, a lot of buildings were razed down. In addition to those raised by the extremely depressing history of conflict from the 18th century. Following that, the British regained control over the city, and to sort of take revenge on its inhabitants for rebelling, they leveled a lot of important structures. There was a mosque, for example, called Akbarabadi Mosque, which was built by one of the Begums, which was, by all accounts, a very magnificent place, but that was pulled down. The Jama Masjid was made into a barracks. Fatehpuri Masjid was sold to Chunna Mal, who was a merchant. And another famous mosque called Zinatul Masjid was made into a bakery. In 1862, the British sort of gave all of these back to the people, but Kolkata was the capital until the 1911 Delhi Darbar. So Delhi sort of declined from that point until New Delhi was established. But even after that, Old Delhi was just on the periphery. It was an afterthought compared to the new city of Delhi.
Some very interesting things, and I'd like to thank you for also setting that whole timeline, right from when it was established in 1648 to like all of the events from the rise to the gradual decline, and what are the big events that triggered those. Also, like you said, there's older Delhis too. So for somebody wanting to kind of look into specifics of those specific periods as well, you could dig into some of the structures from that time too. But all in all, it's been such a enjoyable journey, not just for lovers of history and architecture, but also for lovers of food, right? You kind of gave us a sample of all of these different things. Any final thoughts or even recommendations if somebody is interested in visiting, the types of things they could look up, or even, let's say, from pop culture, like books or movies that you would recommend for somebody to look up? Because not everybody's a history student, Vishnu.
Yeah. Of course, when it comes to books, there are Rana Safi and Sapna Little have written history books in Delhi, which are quite engaging. They've written them for a popular audience. Mm-hmm. But the most famous writer in Delhi is probably William Dalrymple, whose City of Jinns, The Last Mughal and all are bestsellers. So I definitely recommend those. For movies, of course, there's so many movies which are set in and around Old Delhi. I think the most famous one is Delhi 6, which is... Delhi 6 is another name for Old Delhi. So, of course, it's the most... notable. To tell you the truth, I haven't watched too many Bollywood movies, but there's a lot of them which are set there, like Fukre, Delhi Belly, of course, most famously, and Rockstar, as we had covered earlier. As my final thought, I'll just like to say, we've been talking so much about everything that's changed in Delhi throughout the ages, but I'll tell you one thing that hasn't changed. So there's this 18th century account of, Hakim, a Mughal Hakim, and he says that it's absolutely impossible to get through the lanes in Shahjahanabad because they're crowded so thick with people, and you're still going to find that if you go there. So you can be happy you're taking part in a 400-year-old tradition.
No, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, people of Delhi is also an important aspect, and the crowded lanes of Delhi is a phenomenon that you can still find and you can still experience firsthand. Thank you so much, Vishnu, for covering all of these wonderful tidbits, right from history to the variety of other things that you covered. And Vishnu, for somebody who's interested in traveling with you virtually, in the sense through your work, through your Instagram page, what would be the best way to follow your works?
To be honest, I'm only managing an Instagram page. I'm trying to... I also have an account on Threads, which is a new Twitter competitor. I've also tried to keep up a blog, but I haven't really had too much time for it. So pretty much the only way to do it is to follow my Instagram. So I hope you guys will follow it and enjoy what you see on there.
Yeah, it is Charitra Sanchari. What does that
Yes.
stand for? Is that what kind of traveler is that, Vishnu?
Yes, in Malayalam, Charitram means history and Sanchari means traveler. But I've also gotten a lot of messages from people who think I'm a woman because the name apparently sounds feminine.
That's an interesting feedback. But yeah, Charitra Sanchari on Instagram. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes, and do make
Thank
sure
you.
to give Vishnu a follow. Thank you so much, Vishnu, for being with the Musafir Stories and sharing this wealth of knowledge about old Delhi.
Thank you for having me, Saif. It was a great conversation.
That was yet another great episode on the Musafir Stories. Make sure to show us some love by sharing the podcast with your friends and family. We are on Instagram and Twitter at Musafir Stories. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or the website. Follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram.